the best up and coming podcast on the internet. And my name is Hoika Waku Timmons. I'm the host of the No Truce Barred podcast. And if you're not doing so already, make sure you're following the podcast on Instagram at the THE No Truce Barred podcast. Also, if you have not done so already, please, definitely, I don't know what else to say. Go and subscribe to the YouTube channel, which is the No Truce Barred podcast YouTube channel. So currently, I'm working on a few different things with the platform, getting some more guests on, some new locations, and a few other things that I'm keeping under wraps right now at this particular moment. Also, I encourage you, if you've missed any of the previous 80 episodes, those episodes can be found on Spotify, SoundCloud, and Google Podcast. Also, announcement, No Truce Barred after the month of March, No Truce Barred will no longer be available on SoundCloud. So it'll just be available on Google Podcast and Spotify. And then in the month of May, hopefully, I'll start to put episodes up on iTunes. I know I've been promising that for a really long time, but that's definitely coming. And also, I want to thank you guys for the support. Anybody who's shared a piece of content, anybody who's clicked a like button, anybody who's subscribed to the No Truce Barred YouTube channel, anybody who's provided a piece of constructive criticism, I definitely thank you for it. And I do not take it for granted. So thank you for the support. Thank you for any modicum of criticism, good or bad. I thank you because you didn't have to take the time out to do that. And once again, make sure you follow me on Instagram. This is my relatively new page. I have several, but the newest one that is kind of in its infancy at this particular point is the THE_No Truce Barred podcast. So make sure to check me out there. So I want to get into a discussion that I've had with so many people that I know over the course of my lifetime. This is something I know that you all have heard, especially if you're Black, if you're part of the African American community. You've heard people say, well, I'm more Malcolm than I am Martin. Or I'm more Dr. Martin Luther King than I am Malcolm X. And what we do with these two prolific leaders is that we have to juxtapose them. We have to make one more valid than the other. And it's something that I've been so tired of, but I've never really been able to articulate my disdain for this comparison. Because in many cases, this comparison, this juxtaposition of these two great, powerful, astute, brilliant visionaries is often done by folks who really don't have a lot of intel on their lives to actually make these assessments. And the thing I wanted to rant about tonight is, why do we want to take Dr. Martin Luther King and why is it we want to take Malcolm X and we want to put them against each other and negate that both were equally as important to not only the rights of Black folks and African Americans, but on another level to human rights? Because both of these leaders, towards the end of their lives, they would speak on things that affected the Black community, but they also spoke on things that affected and impacted the world, on the world stage, excuse me. And that's the thing that we have to look at. So what are some of the popular narratives that we spin about Dr. Martin Luther King? Well, and Malcolm X, excuse me. Some of the popular narratives and half-truths that we spread about Malcolm X is he taught hate. He wanted to kill non-Black people. He hated all white people. Malcolm X was, a tyrant. We don't understand the nuances of Malcolm X. We don't understand the views that he took on race, slavery, socioeconomic issues as it relates to the Black community. We also overlook the stance that Malcolm X took on world politics, U.S. foreign policy, imperialism and colonialism that was going on all over the globe. We often omit that. And then on the opposite side of the coin, when we talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the thing that's so nefarious that we do with him is that we make his character this soft, mushy image. Dr. King was all about peace. Dr. King was about letting people slap him in the face. And Dr. King, he was all about let's just march. But we don't realize the radical stances that Dr. King took during his time. We don't realize how he was attacking major multi-billion dollar industries in this country or at the behest of African American people. We don't realize the things he truly wanted to do with that march on Washington. We don't realize that at heart, Dr. Martin Luther King was a Pan-African. He often empathized with people like Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana when Ghana gained its independence in 1957. But see, because we haven't really sat down and studied Dr. King, because we haven't really sat down and studied Malcolm X, we could just say all of these erroneous things about both of these gentlemen's characters, and they'll be so off the mark. But the problem with the internet and the problem with social media is that everybody has a voice. And many times these voices are ill-informed. Many times these voices are just voices predicated upon rhetoric, predicated upon things that they perceive as true, with bits and pieces of research and history mixed in here and there so they can sound legitimate when they really aren't qualified to speak on many aspects as it relates to history. What you have to realize, when Dr. King led the bus boycotts, it wasn't just about marches. When Dr. King spoke up against racism and lynchings, it wasn't just about holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Dr. King was strategically attacking not only systemic racism in this country, but he was attacking, he was attacking the facets of corporatism. He was attacking the facets of imperialism, because something that Dr. King made clear is that there are numerous similarities between racism here in the United States and colonialism that you will find all over the world. He spoke out against the imperialistic tactics of the United States during the Vietnam War. They often targeted Dr. King as being a communist or an empathizer with the Communist Party. These were things that they tried to do to delegitimize Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And keep in mind, Dr. King was brilliant. He was a man that received his PhD at 23 years old, and I think Dr. Walter Rodney did the same thing. I'm not trying to take anything away from Dr. King, but he was extremely brilliant. And not only Dr. King, but his father and his brother were all monitored by the government. And one thing I want to say, when you think about what should epitomize an American hero, when we look back at history, we look to people like William Wallace with respect. We look to people like Spartacus with respect. We look to people like George Washington, and to a degree, someone like a Paul Revere with respect. We have St. John's Church here in Richmond, where we look at the famous "Give Me Liberty" or "Give Me Death" speech by Patrick Henry, and we praise it and we look up to it with respect, and we hold these ideals as being synonymous with American independence, being synonymous with heroic acts that we call patriotism. That you see injustice and you speak out against it and you stand up against it and you lay your life on the line and you are willing to die for what you believe in, because you're seeing injustice, you're seeing people being treated unfairly. Whether it's against the British crown or otherwise, and we applaud it. And who doesn't embody that sentiment more than someone like a Dr. Martin Luther King or someone like a Malcolm X? We shouldn't even look at it as two black men. These are heroes for humanity. Wherever you're at in the world, you should be able to look at Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, whether you're white, black, or otherwise, and say these were two men that saw egregious acts of injustice, and they were willing to die to fight for these people. And this is something that anybody should be proud of. In my eyes, Dr. King isn't just a black hero. Malcolm X isn't just a black hero. These are American heroes. Because if we claim as a country we support and we love people that fight for those who don't have a voice, that fight against injustice, how can we not celebrate them? Forget maybe the rhetoric that Malcolm may have spewed in his more NOI black nationalist days. And even with that, you have to understand the context of what the Nation of Islam was at that particular time. And like I said, I've never really agreed with some of the ideas that they taught, but they changed the lives of countless black folks. You have people that literally came to the NOI and couldn't read, people that may have recently gotten out of prison, and they took people that were the pariah and the outcasts of society and made them business owners and farmers and teachers and doctors and lawyers, historians, linguists. They were able to do this, so that shouldn't go negated. But we can look at an organization and disagree with certain teachings and not have to just throw everything away. And so that's how I look at Malcolm and Martin. They spoke up and they spoke out against tyranny. One of the things is that right now we see what's going on in the Ukraine. Pardon me. Right now we see what's going on in Ukraine. You have Russia trying to invade or invading the Ukraine. And the issue is that they don't want the Ukraine to become part of NATO. And I think the Ukrainian president stated that they do not want to join NATO. Since 2001, this country has been engaged in prolonged war, constant battles. But we also know that war is a multi-billion-dollar money-generating machine. This is something that we do know. And it's not anything new. There was a guy, I believe in the 1940s, and correct me if I'm wrong if you're looking at this video. It was a guy by the name of General Smedley Butler, and he wrote this book called War is a Racket. And in this book, he talked about the fact that instead of just opposing evil and fighting against evil, despotic leaders around the world, there was also a huge monetary incentive in war. And he spoke in this book about how active corporations and Wall Street were involved in many of the major wars that this country, have been involved in. This was something that Dr. Martin Luther King also spoke out against as well. And so we have this really vanilla image, this mundane image of Dr. King, where he's just a peace guy. He just wanted to hold hands and he just wanted to turn the other cheek. And we don't realize how many white and black people hated Dr. King. That's something people don't talk about a lot. A lot of black people during Dr. Martin Luther King's lifetime thought he was extremely radical and did not support Dr. King. Now, posthumously, we look back on Dr. Martin Luther King through rose-colored shades, and he's this great hero. But a lot of black folks during his lifetime did not support him. A lot of black people thought that Dr. Martin Luther King was way too radical and were scared to follow him. But that's something that we don't talk about a lot because, once again, we never really sat down to read about Dr. Martin Luther King. But like I said, he spoke out against the imperialistic tactics of the Vietnam War because essentially what Vietnam was a proxy war to stop the spread of the USSR and essentially communism, because Vietnam was a former French colony. We know that Korea was a colony of Japan at one point before we got it. And that's what this was. This was a proxy war. led by Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh, matter of fact, he actually used to go to UNIA meetings, and UNIA stands for the Universal Negro Improvement Association. This is an organization founded by the Jamaican leader Marcus Garvey. He used to go to those, but nonetheless, this is what Dr. King spoke out against. Malcolm X also took an anti-war stance. He actually spoke out against it as well. And one of the things about the Nation of Islam, people talk about his Nation of Islam days. So there was a Japanese nationalist group in Detroit prior to World War II, and they were being monitored by the government. I can't remember the name, but Elijah Muhammad and other members of the Nation of Islam actually interacted with this Japanese nationalist group. And I think they were called, I want to say, the Black Dragon Society. I can't, and you guys can kind of research it, but I was reading about it in one of the books I have here about Malcolm X and his life. But anyway, this particular group, the NOI associated with, and they were monitored by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover at this particular point. And when the war broke out, they got scrutinized even harder because they had an anti-war stance, but they weren't as vocal as Malcolm X would become on many issues related in this country, as it relates to this country. And so I say that to say that Black history, African American history, African history is more intermingled with world issues than we would like to realize. But both of these leaders, not only did they speak out against the racial injustice, the bombing of churches, lynchings, rapes, Malcolm had a more Black nationalist stance, but segregation, and the misconception that we have about segregation is that Dr. Martin Luther King, I heard crazy rumors that aren't founded in any real research that he wanted to be segregated because he had a white mistress or whatnot. But you have to remember this. Black people that were segregated and were not allowed to go into white communities, they still had to pay tax dollars that went towards that white community. Also, it wasn't a thing of one group of people is up here and we want to be just like them. It was a thing of, no, we want the same opportunity and the access to equal education, books, infrastructure, etc. And I think we took this segregation thing and we used it to demonize Dr. Martin Luther King. And people use this quote that Dr. King says that I took my people into a burning house, when the context of that is a lot deeper. The context of him saying that is that he realized that you still have many issues. At the end of his life, he was really talking about wealth and poverty and land distribution. And so Dr. King was looking at it from a far deeper level, that many of these concessions that were received by Black folks were superficial at best, and it goes a lot deeper. Even President Eisenhower, at the end of his term, he provided a caveat and warned against the military-industrial complex. So these are things that Dr. King spoke about. And once again, like I said, whether you agree with it or not, it's just the fact that we have a very generic view of Dr. King. We have a very generic view of Malcolm X. Malcolm X, Malcolm X was a brilliant person. And that's even an understatement. One of the things people always attribute, and I'm not taking nothing away from Malcolm X, I'm not taking nothing away from Elijah Muhammad or the NOI. I'm not taking nothing away from them. But if you study Malcolm X's history and you study his family, you would see that many of the Pan-African roots that would later on flourish or resurface in his life, because later on in life, he formed the OAAU, so the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was modeled after the OAU, which is the Organization of African Unity. And he actually had people like Dr. John Henry Clark that was a part of that organization. And you would see a lot of these Pan-African roots resurface when he would later go on to Nigeria to do lectures, other countries in Africa. I believe he went to Ghana as well. Uh, parts of the Middle East. Even he went and lectured at Oxford. And Malcolm X was not just praised as an activist, but he was praised as an intellectual all across the world. But those roots, those Pan-African roots, you can find those with his parents. Both of his parents were members of the UNIA. What I stated earlier is that the UNIA was the organization founded by Marcus Garvey, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. They had a paper, I believe, called, it was either the Negro World or the Negro Planet, and I always mix it up. But in that paper, a lot of the writers and poets that you would later on find in the Harlem Renaissance got their start writing in that paper. Certain historians like Joel Augustus Rogers, who would go on to write Race and Sex, Volume 1, The World's Great Men of Color, Volumes 1 and 2, contributed to that paper. People like Hubert Harrison and Deuce Muhammad Ali were editors of that particular newspaper as well. And these people would go on to be prolific. But Malcolm X's parents were in charge of establishing the Omaha chapter of the UNIA in Nebraska. And this is where Malcolm X will be born, May 19th, 1925, I believe. And that's where Malcolm would be born. And one of the things that people don't talk about is they talk a lot about his father, but Malcolm X's mother was a powerhouse. Not only was she an intellectual, she was extremely well read. She believed in owning, growing her own food, owning her own business. She knew she knew English, French, and patois, and she was teaching the children French at a young and early age. And one of the things that happened to Malcolm X's mother was that even after her husband died, Earl Little, after he died, she was just such an ardent opponent of racism. She was all about independence and growing her own food and educating her children herself. To put her away, they had to make her look crazy. So this whole thing about Malcolm X's mother losing her mind, that's not entirely true. There was a campaign. She was a powerful woman. And dare you be black and a woman at that time and be outspoken, and not only outspoken, but deeply brilliant and deeply intelligent, they're going to have to make you look crazy and lock you away. And that's what happened to Malcolm X's mother. So I point out Malcolm's parents to say that those roots were already there prior to him joining any organization. These are things that he saw as an early child. As he got older, as he got older and after he left the NOI, and I really don't want to talk about his time spent with the NOI because that's not really the point of this particular episode. When he left and he started to travel and he went on Hajj and he met these different people, he saw that there were issues, and it's not to minimize race, but there were issues that were just as important. Because he spoke out against imperialism. He spoke out against for-profit wars. These are things that Malcolm spoke out against. Both him and Dr. King spoke about the fact that you had European immigrants that came and they were able to get land grants and property by the federal government. Keep in mind, at the same time, 20s, 30s, 40s, when you had redlining and white flight, the federal government prohibited banks to give loans and mortgages to black families to buy homes and to buy land. So you have this juxtaposition and unfair transfer of wealth that both Dr. King and Malcolm X spoke on. And I'm painting this picture because these guys were extremely multifaceted in their approach. They didn't have this monochromatic view of talking about such subjects as politics, race, slavery, etc. These were very brilliant minds, very intricate men who should be admired by all. And I said, I'm going to stop calling these men black heroes. They're American heroes. If we can revere George Washington as a country, you should revere Malcolm X as a country, or Dr. Martin Luther King, because they stood on the principles that we claim to be proud of: independence, speaking up for the voiceless, defending for those who can't defend for themselves. They epitomize, they epitomize what an American hero is and what an American hero should be. You see it in Malcolm X. You see it in Dr. King. Through them, we see the impact of Black Americans on Africans throughout the diaspora. I've talked about this on other videos. It's this enmity between Black people in the United States and those throughout the diaspora in the continent of Africa. So I point this out because Malcolm X's mother had a West Indian background. Dr. King's parents were both Black Americans born here in the United States, descendants of enslaved Africans, if you will. Not to try to emulate anything with the ADOS or the ADOS movement, but it's just the truth, right? I point this out because those people, Dr. King and Malcolm X, along with other earlier leaders such as Dr. Booker T. Washington, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, HBCUs facilitated environments where not only Black people from the Caribbean and the West Indies, but also from the continent of Africa could learn, and gain tools to go and take back to their countries to facilitate their independence. And there was this beautiful symbiotic relationship that existed in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s between Africans on the continent and Black folks throughout the diaspora. But as time went on, it seemed that those relationships started to erode, and there's this juxtaposition a lot. But we see that when Malcolm went and lectured in Nigeria, I believe he was in Lagos, and somebody booed him. And he was there, and the crowd almost beat this guy to death for booing Malcolm X. We see with Dr. Martin Luther King, he revered Kwame Nkrumah and his independence of Ghana, and he said, hey, maybe we could do the same thing here in the United States, even in some place like Alabama or Georgia. Dr. King revered Kwame Nkrumah. But his reverence for Kwame Nkrumah doesn't fit into the little narrative in the box that we came up with for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It doesn't really coincide with that image that we want to project out there about Dr. Martin Luther King. So we see these beautiful relationships between Dr. King and Malcolm X, and those on the continent of Africa. And we have to talk about that. And Nnamdi Azikiwe and Kwame Nkrumah both went to HBCUs. Nkrumah went to Lincoln University. They were also influenced by thinkers in the diaspora. People like George Padmore, people like C.L.R. James, people like Booker T. Washington have profound impacts on leaders that would arise in Africa and leaders that would arise in the Caribbean, and vice versa to a degree. It's just that Black Americans, you being in the United States, you just have such a large platform to galvanize things in comparison with other areas. But I pointed it out to say that their sphere of influence, Dr. King and Malcolm X, it exceeded these borders. Their sphere of influence, it touched Europe. You had students at Oxford that loved Malcolm X. White students at that. In Germany, people in Lebanon that love people like Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And see, when we allow them to be contained in a box, we miss the true influence that both of these gentlemen had on a global level. So I hate this argument of saying, which one do you want to pick, Malcolm or Martin Luther King? Or you'll hear people say, well, you know me, I'm more Malcolm than Martin. You only say that because you don't know what Dr. King stood for. You only say that because you don't know what Malcolm X stood for. How could you even utter that disrespect, that disdain, that idiotic vitriol against both of these great men that you never even sat down and studied? You have no idea what you're talking about. But people will say this. Another thing I have to address, there are two more things I have to address because once again, I love dissenting opinions. So one of my things with Dr. Martin Luther King, as far as like my dissenting opinion goes, is that I think one of the things, and once again, I'm not trying to say what Dr. King should have did. It's just a perspective that I have on Dr. Martin Luther King. If I could say this, maybe this might sound like a dissenting opinion. I think Dr. King could have used a look slightly more of a Marcus Garvey-esque view in some of the things he was doing. Not saying that you need to hate anybody. And I always say this on my platforms. I talk about a lot of sensitive issues. I talk about everything from financial literacy to psychedelics to hip hop to race to ancient civilizations. I talk about a lot on my platform with my guests and otherwise. And I don't believe in the pseudoscience of race. Race is a pseudoscience. I don't believe in hating anybody based upon their phenotype or their pigmentation, right? But I do realize that race is a real issue under the paradigm under which we all live. But I think that a Marcus Garvey-esque ingredient, in my opinion, could have expanded Dr. King's movement even more so, tied with his critiques on imperialism and a few other things. My dissenting opinion with Malcolm X is one thing that he said that he made real popular. And this is something I disagree with Malcolm X on. He made this comparison of the house Negro and the field Negro. And the way he depicted the house Negro is, hey, master, is our house burning? Hey, master, is our food bad? And he depicted the field Negro as the more rebellious one, the one that's going to be on the outside. And I disagree with Brother Malcolm on that because that's not actually true. And a lot of people nowadays have ran with the field Negro, house Negro juxtaposition, where in fact, if you were a house servant, and then you have to realize in different parts of the country, house servants may not have existed. Things would have been different. If you're talking about big plantations, the further down south you go, here in Virginia, there would have been a lot of urban plantations. You would have like yeoman farmers that may have had like one or two slaves. People may have to rent or pay another owner or hire out a hand to come and do, metal work, etc. So the institution of domestic slavery is a lot more intricate and complex than people give it credit for. But when he does that juxtaposition, when Malcolm X compares the field Negro to the house Negro, it's just not true because one of the things was if you were a house slave or servant, you could be raped at any time. You could get beat to death at any time. You may be forced to sleep underneath a porch. You may have to eat food that somebody spit out of their mouth and put it on a plate and gave it to you as their scraps. You would be subject to verbal humiliation on a daily basis. So to be a house slave, from my research, was not the best place in the world to be. And in some ways, it depended, like, for example, in South Carolina, where they have more African people, to be away from the house, you might have been better because you could have gotten a degree of autonomy a little bit more. And it's a lot more complex. And like I said, as a nation, we, white, black, everybody, we should really study this because the slavery epoch in this country produced the world and the events and the climate that we live in now for all of us. The way we talk, the way we interact, the way we do work, the way we look at God, the way we look at everything. It's a product of that. But that's one of the things I disagree with Malcolm on, because there's like a lot of misconceptions we have about slavery. Like when we talk about slaves being named, That's simply not true. It's a very good book called The Slave. Do I have it over here? I cannot think of the name of that book. I've read so much. I'm just a nerd, right? But it's a book by Brian Davis called this. I don't know what it's. Oh, what is this book? What's the name of this book? What's the name of this book? The Slave. Anyway, look up Brian Davis. He wrote a book about slavery here in the United States, but he actually goes back and he talks about slavery. He goes all the way back and he talks about slavery in the Eastern Mediterranean with the Slavs, which is where we get the word slave from. And you know how they were traded around the Mediterranean. As we all know, the Vikings were going down the British Isles and parts of Europe, and they were selling other enslaved white folks around the Mediterranean. So slavery has manifested in different parts of the world in different ways, and this is not to negate the severity of the domestic slave trade, which happened here after 1808. But one of the things that Brian Davis talks about in his book, and another book called The Slave Community by John Blassingame, check out both of those. But one of the things they talk about, a beast of burden. You didn't have any cognition. You didn't have any self-agency. You weren't even worth being named. I remember reading in one of those books, there were, and he kind of like quoted different slave narratives. And certain black folks that were enslaved, they said, well, I could be here and a slave owner or overseer would say, hey, John, come here. And four other people will be named John. And then the next day he might feel like calling you something else. And you didn't have a last name because you were property. You were like a car. So this whole thing of a slave owner took their time out to give people these elaborate names. And sometimes they would do cruel things, like they'll call someone prince or king as a humiliation because you're like treated in such an abysmal, deprived state of humanity, but they'll sadistically call an enslaved person queen or prince at times, or you may have multiple names depending on where you get sold to. And the only reason, like a lot of times, last names were taken is because in certain cases, you knew that your family was sold off to a Smith plantation, or you knew your family was sold off to a Bradford plantation. And sometimes you would take a last name like that in hopes of knowing, or your family could find you, or you can find them through that particular surname. So it's a lot more intricate. There's so much that goes into slavery that we really don't understand. But anyway, that's one of the things I disagree with that Malcolm said was the whole house Negro versus field Negro thing. That was something that I don't think was really that historically accurate. Maybe the information that he had available to him at the time, it seemed like the most accurate thing to say when it really wasn't. So, maybe. And people, so J. Edgar Hoover wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King, and he stated that if he does not stop leading these different movements, in the letter that J. Edgar Hoover wrote to Dr. Martin Luther King, he stated, if you don't stop, promoting these radical ideas and leading these different movements, we're going to reveal that you're a womanizer. Not only that, you should go ahead and kill yourself and commit suicide so you don't have to go through the pain and embarrassment, and your family won't have to experience that embarrassment. And I've heard people on different social media apps, they'll talk about Dr. King negatively because they're like, oh, he's a womanizer and we shouldn't listen to him. I'm going to say this. I don't care if Dr. King was a womanizer. It doesn't matter at all. It doesn't take anything away from what he's done to help humanity. It doesn't. And it's such a weak argument to try to discredit this man posthumously by saying that he was a womanizer. We are human, and we all have faults, and we all have flaws. And I don't think it's fair to try to use that against Dr. King as a reason why we shouldn't take his legacy seriously. It's a really, really poor excuse to use against Dr. King. And the last thing, let's stop saying I'm not my ancestors or I'm not my grandparents. Listen, you don't understand the mentality and the fortitude that those people had. Everybody that risked their life at a sit-in, everybody who marched against the police at that time period, everybody who boycotted the buses, everybody who organized any sort of grassroots organization, anybody that tried to get black people to the polls to vote, you don't understand the bravery and the fortitude that these men and women had. And for you to say that you're not them is just idiotic and stupid, because you honestly don't have the spine or the heart to be them. Many of us don't. And that's just the truth. Look, this has been episode 81 of No Truths Barred. I thank you for listening to this new episode. Make sure you follow me on YouTube at No Truths Barred Podcast. Make sure you follow the Instagram at the THE_No Truths Barred Podcast. Take care. Until next time. Peace.